Good afternoon, everybody. UFOs, as the subtitle says, are there any images that need an extraterrestrial explanation? And we start by just asking ourselves about whether or not people believe that UFOs are extraterrestrial. In a survey, when people were asked, have extraterrestrial aliens visited Earth, some 40% said possibly, maybe, yeah. Admittedly, the caveat is that this is a rather old survey from 2018, quite a few years old now, and it was a survey of Americans. I've got no idea what a similar survey would give us in Europe or indeed in the UK. But this particular survey, when asking about not only have extraterrestrials visited us, but are they visiting us now? Do aliens walk amongst us? You might think that that would be a much lower figure if you think that perhaps there have been evidence of ancient aliens, but not anymore. But in fact, that number was very similar, 35%. Now, the worrying thing is that, okay, that's less than the number who believed in ghosts, apparently, and greater than the number who believed in telekinesis or even Bigfoot. But I guess the most worrying thing about this American survey was that the number of people who believe that extraterrestrial aliens are visiting us now, 35%, is actually greater than the number who believe in evolution. Take what you will from that particular set of statistics. But if you think about the fact that in decades past, none of us used to have cameras on us, and if anybody saw a UFO, the chances are that basically they wouldn't get photographed. But now everybody has a camera with them all the time. So you could argue that in the last few years we've conclusively settled all of these questions about flying saucers, lake monsters, ghosts, Bigfoot, etc. Because surely if these things did exist, with so many billions of cameras on the go all the time in people's mobile phones, then surely we'd have some decent images of them by now. So isn't this issue settled? Well, no. I did a Google check of how many web pages are there that talk about UFOs in some way or another. I found about 250 million of them. So you could argue there's a huge amount of interest in UFOs. Not everybody believes that they are extraterrestrial, but there's certainly an awful lot of interest. So this issue is certainly not settled. For this talk, I argue that UFOs can be put into a number of different categories. I would argue that some images of UFOs are basically images of man-made objects. Some of them are natural objects. Some of them are not objects at all in the sense that they are simply image artifacts created by the camera and the imaging process itself. And some of them are deliberately faked. And of course, the elephant in the room is, well, actually there is a fifth category. And the fifth category is that UFO images could indeed be extraterrestrial spacecraft. So we're going to look at each of those categories and see what sort of images we can find. To start with definitions, just to make sure we're all basically singing from the same hymn book, I conform to the conventional usage of UFO to mean an object observed in the sky that is not readily identified. There's a tendency to now call them UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, but I'm going to stick to UFO. Regarding the possibility of an extraterrestrial origin, I side with Carl Sagan, who expressed the adage, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If you're going to look at an image of something and claim that this something is an extraterrestrial visitor, that evidence has to be very strong indeed. And another useful tool for the rational scientist is Occam's razor, which can be expressed in a number of different ways, but basically it says if there are two explanations for an observation, then the explanation that requires the least speculation is usually the better of the two. And that is sometimes paraphrased as simpler solutions are more likely to be correct than complex ones. So you can look at a whole load of images and say one possibility is that these images are extraterrestrial spacecraft, but I would argue there's nearly always a much simpler explanation. Where do you find reliable information about UFOs? Well, there's a lot of places in America you can find reliable information, like this one, for instance, the UFO Information Center. Notice the little green man on the left-hand side sitting on the porch there. But apart from that, you may ask yourself, well, wouldn't it be nice if people thought they saw a UFO if they were able to capture a nice clear image of it? If a spacecraft visited the Earth and we obtained a picture like this that was clear, detailed, in focus, with no apparent camera shake and well exposed, then we would have plenty of evidence that spacecraft have visited us. But in fact, most UFO images don't look like that. A typical UFO image looks more like that. It's generally blurred, it's usually out of focus, it's usually accompanied by lots of camera movement, which again make the object look very blurred, and if it's taken at night, it's almost invariably overexposed. And if we take an image like that and blow it up, well, it really doesn't help. Instead of a small blurry blob, we get a big blurry blob. And this is exacerbated by the fact that a lot of UFO images, a lot that I've trawled through to try and get material for this talk, a lot of them date back to the period where people were using film emulsion rather than digital cameras. And with digital cameras, they are time-stamped and sometimes geolocated, so you know where and when they were taken. And there's all sorts of information about the camera that was used. But with pre-digital images, such as this one, we have essentially no context. We don't know who took it. We don't know what date. We don't know what time. We don't know what camera. We don't know what lens. We don't know what settings were used. What was the exposure? What was the aperture? What was the focus setting? We have essentially no information relating to the image, and therefore without context, it's essentially impossible to tell whether this blurry blob is a torch or a streetlight or Venus or a visiting spacecraft. Without that additional information, if we can't see what it is we're looking at, it's almost impossible to tell what is going on. I asked myself what were the first UFOs that were recorded, and I looked at this carving on the side of a wall in Egypt, and I thought, well, this must have been doctored surely, because we appear to have an Apache helicopter in the background, and we appear to have Luke Skywalker's land speeder and what looks like a Zeppelin. Surely this is just somebody taking this image and doctoring it in a graphics package to make it look like interesting objects. But no, this is a genuine picture of a carving on a wall in Egypt. And so you might say, well, are these indications of UFOs that were seen at the time? But again, it only takes a little bit of digging to realise that no, there is a much simpler explanation for these odd-looking carvings. And that is the fact that there were actually two pharaohs that each had their own set of carvings, and effectively they reused the wall. Much like you might take a sheet of paper and erase the pencil marks and rewrite over the top. In this case, they didn't chisel away the previous hieroglyphs before adding their own. And when you see the image color-coded according to which pharaoh we're dealing with, you see that actually there's nothing interesting there at all. We're just fooled by the fact that the overlap of two sets of hieroglyphs seem to show interesting shaped objects. So let's have a look at some of these categories. UFOs might be man-made objects. And the US Air Force has tried to make it easy for us, just in case we confuse flying aircraft that belong to the USAF compared to what might be genuine UFOs. So here we see a number of objects, and the United States Air Force has very cleverly identified each of them for us. So the first one, for instance, is not a stealth aircraft, it's a weather balloon. The second one is a weather balloon. The third one is a weather balloon. This one is a weather balloon. The next one is a weather balloon. And in case you're wondering, the next one is swamp gas. And then we have a weather balloon, another weather balloon, not a supersonic bomber, no, it's a weather balloon, and that is quite definitely a weather balloon, as is that, as is that, as is that. So, okay, a little bit of a joke there, but it's clear that if you see rather interesting looking objects close to a United States Air Force base, or indeed even a base in other countries, there's quite a possibility that you're looking at a secret military aircraft that the military really don't want you to know about. So they're not going to go advertising their latest stealth technology. But let's have a look at this image. I hope that shows up okay on your screen. Is this a long exposure of a fleet of UFOs flying in formation? We have a little bit of a tree in the foreground, this dark region in the left-hand side, and I think that's a silhouette of a leaf that's coming into the front there as well. And clearly we have a horizon. But what do you think it is that we're looking at here? Is it a fleet of aircraft? Is it a long exposure? I'll give you a few seconds to have a think about what it is you think we're looking at. I actually got this image from Pylon of the Month, December 2019. Excuse me. And when I say Pylon of the Month, yes, I mean an electricity pylon. And on this particular night, this was imaged where you can't actually see the pylon itself. Let me put back the pylon where it probably would be in this image. Now, I hope you can see what it is we're actually looking at. We're not looking at a long exposure of a lot of objects flying in formation. We're looking at the cables, the electricity cables of this particular pylon and its set of cables. This particular night, it was icy, so ice has formed on the cables, and the ice is simply reflecting whatever the light is on the other side of the horizon. So it's easy to get fooled, especially if you don't know the context. I tried to fool you into thinking it was a long exposure of something moving, but actually it's not. It's simply a whole load of cables. And if you're interested, if you really want to go exploring for yourself, yes, it is a real website. Pylonofthemonth.org will show you lots of images of pylons across the UK. Excuse me a second, I've got a bit of a frog in my throat. Right. And of course, more recently, much more recently, we've had lots of odd-looking objects in the sky because more and more rockets are being launched across the world, especially in the United States, and the rocket exhausts can sometimes give rather fantastic trails behind them, especially if the rocket launch is around about sunrise or sunset, because even though it's relatively dark where we are, the rocket is high enough in the atmosphere to catch sunlight. And you can get some beautiful rocket trails that get moulded or sculpted by winds at different altitudes. And in this particular case, the rocket trail has produced this iridescent effect as well. You'd be totally forgiven for thinking, if you were to see something like this, that perhaps this is a sign of alien invasion. You don't often see large glowing objects in the sky like this. This was taken from Astronomy Picture of the Day back in 2019. And if you did a little bit of research, you could find out what was going on. But at first sight, it would be perfectly understandable if you said there's something very alien about what we're looking at here. In fact, this is a scientific experiment. Scientists sent up a whole load of sounding rockets high into the atmosphere, maybe about 100 miles or so up, and released elements that basically glow under sunlight. They get ionized by the ultraviolet light from the sun and produce these colors. The idea is if you release these clouds in the upper atmosphere and watch them, you can see how they move and you get an idea of how the upper atmosphere is actually moving. In other words, what winds you have at various heights. And you also get an idea of what radiation we have from the sun at various heights in the atmosphere. It gives us a way of studying aurora rather than waiting for aurora, where we have particles from the sun hitting the upper atmosphere, causing the oxygen and nitrogen to fluoresce or glow. Here we do an experiment in which we actually place glowing clouds of gas in the atmosphere and then watch them to see how they move. Gives us a way of studying the upper atmosphere. But if you didn't know those experiments were going on, you could easily confuse this with a UFO. These days, the idea of lights in the sky, well, a few decades ago, a sight like this might be rather odd, and you might be convinced that you're seeing a fleet of UFOs flying through the air. But of course, in the last few years, we've got much more used to the idea of drones flying in formation. Here, the choreography is not as good as it is these days. Now we can get the choreography of individual drones flying with lights so good that we can map out effectively any shape we like in the sky. So what would have been thought of as a UFO some years ago is now thought of, oh, right, another drone show. Some people have said, well, apart from UFOs, I can actually see where the UFOs are landing. I might not be able to see the UFOs in this picture, but I can see where they've landed at these 3 places on the ground here. A picture taken from an aircraft, and you can ask yourself, well, surely it's not that difficult to work out what they are, because if you know when you took the picture, you know what part of the land you are flying over, even if it's a relatively desolate part of the desert. You can work out where you are either from the map on the back of the seat in front of you, or from simply knowing if you took off at this time and landed at that time, then when you took the picture you must have been over this part of the world. And in this particular case, although this looks very odd, these 3 odd-shaped objects on the ground here, when you realize where it is in the world you are, and you simply go to a map and actually look at what is actually located there, you find it's a solar power station, or at least a solar plant designed for either generating power or incinerating. So here we have a lot of reflective mirrors, all positioned such that they reflect the sun to the central furnace at the center of that large collection. And of course, depending on how high you are in the aircraft that you're flying over and exactly what the angle of the sun is, you can get some interesting reflections from all of these mirrors. So yes, it looks a little bit odd when you're flying a few miles above the ground, looking down on these structures, but it's perfectly understandable. I got sidetracked from thinking originally about images to thinking about videos. And I've taken the audio off this because it's really annoying, but here some person has said, look, there's a cigar-shaped UFO flying over the lake. This is fantastic. This is proof that aliens have visited us. And it's a little bit shaky, as most videos are. And this particular video was posted on social media, and very quickly thousands and possibly even millions of people said, wow, this is amazing footage of a UFO, a cigar-shaped UFO flying over the lake. It actually only took a few hours for the explanation to appear on social media, but that didn't stop people ignoring the explanation completely and still posting, yes, this is obviously a UFO. The actual explanation came back fairly quickly, and the Goodyear people said, we don't want to get in the way of a good story, but sorry guys, that's definitely us. In other words, on the other side of the lake there was, I don't know, maybe it was a football stadium or something like that, and the Goodyear blimp was there doing its aerial photography. But the point is that if you post something that looks interesting on social media, even though the explanation very quickly comes and shoots it down, that doesn't stop the whole story completely going viral and people circulating this UFO footage. Whilst looking at that one, again, as happens when you start looking at YouTube videos, you start getting recommendations of, well, there are other videos you might like to see. And one caught my eye, super clear footage of a UFO. I thought, well, given that most UFOs are rather blurry and rather difficult to see, I really ought to have a look at this super clear footage. So I thought that's well worth a look. So here it is. So one assumes that this video is zoomed in and the person doing the video is having great difficulty keeping the camera still, which is a big problem whenever you have a small object at a great distance. To his credit, or her credit, eventually they did settle down and get a much better image of this object. And once it starts getting just a little bit steadier, maybe they zoomed in a bit more, maybe they steadied themselves, it doesn't take long before you can realize what it actually is. That's still there at the end, shows you that it's a large J-shaped balloon. So one assumes that some child, perhaps called Jeremy or perhaps called Jennifer, had a birthday and their balloon escaped and floated off into the atmosphere, and a mylar balloon is very reflective. So as soon as it catches the sun, you get a lot of light and a lot of interesting colours. And if you can't see the shape, it might simply look like a large object which is flashing different colours of light at a great distance. So if you can't actually see the detail, you might believe that a party balloon is a UFO. But again, my interest was piqued at this point because I originally did not intend looking at videos. I was going to concentrate only on images. But again, I just happened to glance at this thinking maybe this is worth a look. There was a particular video that had this banner across it saying, Puerto Rico's close proximity to the Bermuda Triangle may explain why it's known as a hotbed of UFOs. There have been countless sightings, but many experts consider this next piece of footage the gold standard. I thought, well, there's thousands upon thousands of videos on YouTube that all purport to show UFOs. But I wondered, well, if this one is considered to be the gold standard, the one by which all other videos are judged, if this is supposed to be the most convincing video of a UFO, then I guess I really ought to have a look at it and have a look to see whether this gold standard for UFO sightings actually stands up to scrutiny. So I thought it's worth having a look. It was taken by the US Customs and Border Patrol from an aircraft. It's an infrared camera in an aircraft. Now, the US Customs and Border Patrol are interested in immigrants and in contraband, and generally speaking, they are fairly well funded, which means the technology in this infrared camera on this aircraft is probably fairly high tech. Not only that, but I noticed that this video, which runs for a couple of minutes or so, has got an awful lot of useful information in it, which we'll come to in just a moment. Let's watch the video. The camera seems to be tracking an object moving at incredible speed, in this case from right to left, and they are trying to point the camera at this object as it hurtles along the ground. And it seems to be passing over trees and a little bit of rural area. Maybe that was a lake. It passes over a few trees. It passes over a few houses. It passes over more fields. That looks like perhaps an industrial estate it's flying over there. And after a little while, it starts to fly over a taxiway and then the runway of an airport. And UFOs are often said to be interested in what's going on in our military bases and our airports. So this particular UFO continues on its way, having flown over the airport. It flies over what is presumably another industrial estate. There's some cars on the road. And it continues. So the whole video is actually quite a few minutes long. So I thought this was worth having a good look at because it's reasonably good quality. It's taken with a high-tech camera and it's a few minutes long and it's got all this useful information attached to it. Down in the bottom left, that is the GPS coordinates of the aircraft. ACFT is aircraft, and every frame of the video is stamped with exactly where the aircraft was when it took that image of the video. And in the bottom right-hand corner, target is basically the point on the ground where the camera is pointing. So I said this was high tech. The camera knows which way it's pointing and the aircraft knows which way it is flying. And therefore, by using both bits of information, where's the camera pointing relative to the aircraft and where's the aircraft pointing, you can work out which point on the ground you're looking at. That's quite important if you're trying to look for instance, somebody who seems to be smuggling stuff across the border, knowing exactly where they are so you can tell ground forces to go and catch them. So that's the GPS coordinates of where the camera is looking. Just out of interest, we can ask ourselves, how big is this object that we're tracking? The objects seem to go over a field, and in the background there are almost rectangular shaped objects, which I'm assuming are warm, because in this infrared image, dark means warm and light means cooler. So I think these are warm objects in a field, and I think they're probably cows. That tells us that this object, if it's at a similar distance to the cows, this object is perhaps a little bit smaller than a cow, so maybe less than a meter or so in size. And as it flies over a road, again we see cars there, cars that seem to have a black end and a white end because the engine is warm and the rest of the car is cooler, and that reminds us that in this case dark means warm. So we have a few clues. It seems to be possibly the same sort of temperature as a cow or the bonnet of a car. It is not that large, it is smaller than a cow, smaller than a car, and we have this information about exactly where the aircraft and the UFO appeared to be. When I used those coordinates, I found that, not surprisingly, it ended up in Puerto Rico, because that's what the caption of the YouTube video said. So this is what we're talking about. There's the scale, about 1 kilometre at the bottom there. Let's just dim down the land because it's not particularly important what's on the ground. That is the track of the UFO. In other words, I've taken the coordinates in the bottom right-hand corner of the video and mapped out where the UFO appears to be moving. And it's moving in the direction of the arrow from left to right as we look at it. And it was noted at the time that there was a wind coming from the northeast, a moderate breeze. And it is claimed by the people who captioned this video that this proves it's a UFO because this object is flying into the wind. And yet it has no apparent means of propulsion, and yet it's flying into a headwind. Okay, that's what they claim. But that's only half the story. Remember, we've got the location of the UFO, strictly the location of where the camera was pointing, but we've also got the coordinates of the aircraft itself. And the aircraft was flying, as indicated there, from right to left. So I took all of those points. This is not every frame of the video. This is something like, I don't know, every few seconds of the video, I've made a note of where the aircraft was and where the UFO appeared to be. And if we want to work out the movement of the UFO, we can simply say, for a given frame, we say that's where the aircraft was, and it must have been looking in this direction because the target, as indicated by the coordinates in the bottom right of the video, says that that's the point on the ground it was looking at. So that's not necessarily where the UFO was. The UFO is somewhere on that grey line. And we can do the same thing again for other frames of the video. And we can do it again 20 seconds later, and again 20 seconds later, and again 20 seconds later. What do you notice about all of those grey lines? They all intersect at one point. So one possibility is the UFO is skimming over the ground at great speed, travelling in the direction of the blue arrow. The other possibility is that the UFO is static. And the only reason it appears to be moving a lot towards the northwest is because the aircraft is flying at a few hundred miles an hour to the southwest. And it's simply the illusion of a static object that appears to be moving because the camera is moving. It's a very simple argument, but it's an argument that's missed completely by the people who post these UFO videos. I continued looking at that track beyond the clip I've shown you. It goes on for a few minutes, and there's evidence that after a few minutes the object has moved ever so slightly towards the west-southwest. And remember, the wind is blowing, roughly speaking, in that direction. So this observation is entirely consistent with an object that's barely moving at all and is perhaps drifting ever so slightly downwind. So when we think of the claims that are made on YouTube, remember this is the gold standard of UFO videos. The YouTube description says that we're looking at a metallic orb moving at incredible speed with no obvious propulsion into an 18-mile-an-hour headwind. The experts say the infrared camera sees an object that does not match anything we know of. I don't know who these experts are, but you have to ask yourself, how are they coming to these conclusions? Because there's no evidence in the video that this is a metallic orb. It is something that appears to be a bit warmer than its surroundings. Difficult to tell its size, certainly can't really tell what it's made of or what its shape is. Moving at incredible speed. No, the video does not show an object moving at incredible speed. That's one interpretation, but there's no proof that that's what we get out of the video. They claim no obvious propulsion. Well, I would agree. There's no wings, there's no engines, there's no obvious propulsion. And it's flying into an 18-mile-an-hour headwind. No, I don't think there's any evidence for that either. And who are these experts that don't really know what it is they're looking at? Occam's Razor asks, is there an alternative explanation to the one that's posted on YouTube? Well, I would argue that the object is essentially static. If anything, it is moving ever so slightly, drifting slowly downwind. What conclusion can you come to? Well, what objects don't move very fast and drift with the wind? I think it's a balloon. Possibly even similar to the one we saw before. Maybe it's a mylar balloon which warms up during the day and stays warm and radiates so it looks warmer than its surroundings. When we revisit what's said on the left-hand side, no obvious propulsion, well, if it's drifting downwind, then, well, yes, there is some obvious propulsion. It's the wind that's blowing it. So really, that ought to be an X as well. So you can see, here's Occam's Razor. We either have a very complex explanation for what we're looking at, or we have a much simpler explanation. And in principle, we can't prove which of these is correct. But Occam's Razor says if we have a complex solution and a simple solution to the same observation, well, most of the time, the simple one is the right explanation. Let's move on to the next category. UFOs might be natural objects. And we're done with pylons of the month. Now we're going with clouds of the month. The Cloud Appreciation Society has a post which is the cloud of the month. And sometimes you see some rather unusual looking clouds, especially appearing over mountaintops. Why you might get a cloud deck which appears to have a large sort of fairy ring around it, well, that takes a little bit of explanation. But again, when you realize that you're not that far from an airport, then you realize that, okay, occasionally aircraft go into holding patterns before flying into the airport. And this is the result of an aircraft flying through the cloud, which you can't see, disturbing the cloud in a rather odd looking way. Again, flying saucer clouds, so-called lenticular clouds, are actually quite common. I like that one just because it looks spectacular and looks like the opening sequence of the film Independence Day, where the alien spaceships come and visit Earth. And occasionally you see these things, which again look rather odd. It looks like a hole punch has been pushed through a cloud, as if a large circular object has come through the cloud deck and landed and left a big hole in the sky. Yes, it can look a little bit odd, but meteorologically speaking, these things are explicable. I'm not going to go through the details of what conditions of pressure and water vapor, humidity, etc. you need, but it is possible for these so-called full streak clouds to actually exist naturally. Sometimes you can get some rather spectacular clouds appearing over mountaintops. Even though in themselves they're rather spectacular, that doesn't stop people taking an image like this, putting it into a graphics package and augmenting it somewhat to make it look even more spectacular. But I would argue there's no need for that because they're amazing enough as they are. Sometimes in some parts of the world you see this phenomena. It looks like vertical searchlights over the horizon pointing directly up into the sky. And again, if you've never seen them before, they would look rather odd, especially when you realise there are no searchlights down there on the other side of these houses. But again, once you realise what the explanation is, well, this is a rather cold environment. You can see from the snow on the ground, it was taken from Finland. And it's quite common to get ice in the atmosphere, ice platelets, very small pieces of ice that are effectively like small chunks of hexagonal plates, and they tend to sit horizontally. They're virtually a set of mirrors, and they tend to sit horizontally just because aerodynamically that's more stable than being in any other orientation. So if you have a lot of tiny icy platelets in the sky, all of which are horizontal, they tend to act like mirrors. So all we're really doing here is seeing the reflections of streetlights that are on the other side of these houses. And they appear to be vertical simply because these tiny ice platelets are horizontal, mainly horizontal. And the appearance of these things can be quite spectacular. The colour is simply a consequence of the fact that the coloured lights themselves, the street lights or whatever they are coloured, in this case, either bluish or yellowish. And they can give this rather spectacular result. I've not seen it myself, but it must be amazing to see, especially when these ice formations occur in the upper atmosphere or the higher parts of the atmosphere, because then they can reflect light from some considerable distance away. So here it almost looks like you've got a city in the sky reflecting the street lights or whatever those lights are in the very distance there, many, many miles away. And again, if you weren't familiar with this phenomena, you could perhaps think that there's something very odd going on in the upper atmosphere there. Until recently, we didn't know these things actually existed for real, so-called red sprites. People had reported seeing odd effects above thunderstorms. We know what happens below a thunderstorm. You get lightning between the cloud, and sometimes you get lightning from the cloud to the ground, the familiar result of a thunderstorm. But actually you can get, if you like, lightning above thunderstorms, effectively lightning discharges to space. And we weren't too sure if they were real because it was rather difficult to capture these things. It's a very fleeting flash of red, but with modern technology we now have cameras that are capable of collecting this information. And that itself looks quite spectacular, to see a whole forest of what appear to be lightning strikes above a thundercloud. You can barely see the thundercloud itself at the bottom of the picture here. But more recent images still show an incredible structure. When you look at that, you think, wow, how on earth does that thing come to be? And again, if you saw an image like that without any context, if you didn't realize that you were looking at effectively lightning above a thundercloud, again, you would be forgiven to thinking this is obviously an alien invasion of some kind. Why they have that structure, why they have that colour, why it looks like we've got a whole load of forking structures below and this odd looking cone above at the top of each of these, again, we really don't know. We haven't been studying this phenomena for long enough to really understand the detail of what's going on. But to the best of our knowledge, it is indeed a natural phenomenon. If I'm talking to astronomers, like this afternoon, well, this is something that's a rather easy one to deal with. It was described as an arc-shaped UFO over Ontario, and the associated text was this. Nearing the end of the day, I sat down on my deck, facing west. Something caught my eye. It was brilliant white. In truth, I cannot be sure what it truly is. My conclusion, a UFO. A reminder that if people see things that they can't instantly identify, there's a knee-jerk reaction to say, oh, it must be a UFO if I don't know what it is. How large was this object that was seen? Well, my friend thinks the object is as big as 2 airliners. Gives you an idea of how large an object we're talking about. This individual said, well, I thought 1 airliner, not 2, but maybe he's right. This is a reminder that if you actually don't know how far away the object is that you're looking at, there is actually no way of sensibly determining how large it is. So we're saying that the object is one airliner in size or two airliners in size, that means nothing if you haven't actually figured out how far away the object is. So if you zoom in and with your camera or your video camera, I think in this case it was a video camera and then a still was extracted, what do you think is an arc-shaped object that is brilliant white and seen in the west in the evening? Astronomers will usually come up with a solution fairly quickly. It's Venus. And of course, Venus can be crescent-shaped or half disc shaped, or it can be effectively a crescent Venus or a gibbous Venus or a nearly full Venus, depending on where it is relative to the sun. But for some people, especially non-astronomers, they are not aware that A, Venus is really bright some evenings, and not only that, but if seen through binoculars, you can actually see that Venus does have phases, like the moon, crescent phase, half phase, etc. And so if anybody is not familiar with Venus, perhaps it's no surprise that they get a bit spooked by the idea that not only is it incredibly bright, but also it's arc-shaped, as they call it here, or crescent-shaped. But no surprise to us astronomers. Okay, let's think of another category. Let's think about the fact that UFOs might not be man-made objects or natural objects. They might be image artifacts. Here, some mysterious lights were seen over Washington, D.C. in 1952. We seem to have these rather odd-looking, Star Wars TIE fighters or something buzzing over the Capitol. But if we look at the lights in the foreground and turn them upside down and send them to the top, notice that the pattern of these, whatever they are, is exactly the same as the pattern of where these lights sit. In other words, if you've got a lot of bright light shining into the camera, the reflections, which will tend to be upside down because they're reflections, well, you'll find that there's a whole load of reflections whenever you get bright lights shining into the camera. And this can produce all sorts of odd artifacts. Here, this image was associated with the text, "This large craft came so close to the photographer, the windows can even be seen in the image." I don't know if that's one of the windows. Maybe there's a pilot there waving at us. But when you realise that's part of a much bigger image, despite the fact that the photographer says this is proof of aliens. Aliens is in capitals, so that really must be proof. Well, no, when you realise that this is actually part of that image, you realise that somebody has tried photographing presumably the moon, maybe the full moon, and it's shining directly into the camera, and it is so bright it's producing a bit of distortion there. Maybe the lens itself of the camera had a fault and produced this particular rather odd looking reflection. But it happens in modern times as well. Here's an image that was posted on social media. I took this picture of this lamp and then I noticed there was something odd in the sky. I don't remember seeing that at the time, but there it is. It seems to have an aura around it. Is it a UFO? And they attached, because this was, I think, tweeted at the time, it was attached with the tags UFO and also hashtag serious question. They really did want to know what this was. But if you blow it up and have a look more closely, what is it we're looking at? Well, remember, we're shooting into the sun. The sun is peeking out behind that wall. The sun is a disk and it's half hidden by the wall. What are we looking at here? Well, we're looking at an upside down version of that. We're looking at an upside down reflection. There's the disk of the sun, half hidden by the fact that it's behind a wall, and it's shining through this iron filigree work of the bracket holding the lamp, and hence we can see these odd looking lines coming across it. That's exactly what you would expect. If you take a picture of the sun peeking out behind a wall, you would expect to get a reflection like that. And similarly, a lot of people are quite keen to say, well, look at this weird thing I photographed. It appears to be a flat rectangular aircraft with lights hovering around its edges, hovering in the air. And well, UFO enthusiasts, it is said, have claimed it is an advanced type of spycraft known as a TR-3B. Notice how much authority you can put behind something rather than just saying it's a UFO. If you say it's a TR-3B, it makes it sound like you know what you're talking about. So maybe this is a large slab type object hovering in the air. But I think this was photographed through a car or a truck windscreen. You can see the raindrops there from the headlights. I think rather than being a large object floating in the sky, a much simpler explanation is we're looking through a windscreen of a car. Are we looking at the reflection of an iPhone sitting on the dashboard? Seems a much more likely explanation to me than thinking about a large object hovering in the sky. Fourth category, UFOs might be faked. If you need to have a finger pointing at the object, well, that's obviously a fake, fair enough. And anything that looks like this, again, if there really was a spaceship like that arrived and started hovering over an interstate, well, quite a few million people would see it, and I think we'd know about it. So that is, again, clearly just a bit of graphic fakery. But if we look at a few old images, we can get clues from those as well. Here's a picture from 1966 that I found, and I thought that's interesting. I wonder. I looked at the UFOs, and I looked at the object in the foreground here, which I think are tram lines, tram cables to power trams. The object itself is quite blurry, whereas the tram lines, the cables, whatever they are, appear to be quite sharp. And in this case, I think what they've done is take a standard image that's focused on either the tram lines or the tram cables or the houses in the background. They've added some spacecraft, but they've made them a little bit too blurry. If it was blurred because of movement, it would be blurred in one direction only. But this is blurred in all directions, and that's simply a mistake of the people who cut and paste these UFOs into this original black and white image. Because if we look at how sharp they should be, by looking at the detail in those tram cables, there is simply not enough detail there. This is the opposite problem, in the sense the opposite fakery. It's rather too dark to see what's going on in this shocking new footage of alien ship over Chicago, so I took the image and just brightened it up a bit so I could see what was going on. And this is the opposite problem. Here they've taken a background and added in a triangular UFO which is too sharp, not too blurry. The mottling in the background is perfectly normal noise that you get in any image, such as a JPEG image which has got some noise, some mottling of the intensities there. But look at that edge of the UFO. It is razor sharp compared to the mottling in the background. That's not what you would get if you were actually imaging a triangular object in the sky. So here, the person doing the cut and pasting has not made it too blurry, they've made it too sharp. And here they say that this is Air Force One being buzzed by a couple of UFOs. No, they don't seem to be right to me. If you look at what's going on the underside of Air Force One, it is not particularly high contrast and ever so slightly blue, because the scattering of light between Air Force One and us, it's probably a couple of miles away or something, the sky is blue because air scatters light and it tends to scatter blue more, so objects at a great distance tend to be slightly blue and low contrast. These objects appear to be grey, they don't appear to be in any way blue, and they appear to have a contrast which is rather higher than you would expect for an object that is lit on one side by the sun and in shadow on the other side. So here the person doing the cutting and pasting has got the contrast slightly wrong. Here we have a triangular UFO sitting on the deck of an aircraft carrier. I wondered if it was possible to actually prove rather than just suppose that this image had been doctored. So I looked at the intensities of individual pixels. Image processing is something I do or did quite a lot when I was a full-time researcher at the university. So I took a whole load of pixel values from the deck close to this F-18 fighter, which is probably genuine because most aircraft carriers do have these aircraft. I took the intensities of pixels and plotted them out as a function of pixels there. So for a few dozen pixels, I plotted out how bright is the pixel, and you get a rather wiggly line because you wouldn't expect all the pixels to be the same intensity. There's bound to be a little bit of variation. There's bound to be a little bit of noise. That's perfectly normal. I then looked at the pixel intensities in a region close to the triangular UFO and found that, well, it's a little bit noisy, but then look at this, absolutely dead straight, and then it goes noisy again. So these pixels in this region here, right next door to the triangular UFO, are definitely unnatural. They have been doctored, they have been faked, it's been over smoothed. And somebody has cut and pasted a triangular UFO onto the deck of the aircraft carrier and then tried to tidy up any edges and got it wrong. I also noticed that the shadow is unusually sharp as well. So again, that doesn't seem quite right. So I can pretty much prove that that is not an undoctored image. And for this one, somebody claimed to be on holiday, taking pictures out at their aircraft window. Looks like EasyJet from the colours. And then this UFO flew past. But when I looked at this UFO, it bears a striking resemblance to a certain CGI aircraft, if you want to call it an aircraft, from a certain video game that I am unable to name for legal reasons. So it looks like somebody has simply taken that aircraft and cut and pasted it into their video to claim they were buzzed in their aircraft by a UFO. And of course, AI is getting even better at actually showing images. So apart from the fact it's easy enough to fake, there will be more and more AI generated images that again are getting more and more difficult to tell from the real thing. And the elephant in the room, the final category, is that UFOs might indeed be extraterrestrial spacecraft. Somebody's tried to make it easy for us by actually cataloguing all the UFOs that exist. This is UFO sightings set 1, so presumably there are more. I couldn't find set 2. And if you look at the bottom, perhaps you can read that it says 80 UFO models based on actual sightings. So these categories, A1, A2, A3, somebody has sat down and gone through all of the sightings of UFOs and tried to make it clear what particular types exist. But there's no real evidence. NASA, not calling them UFOs, calling them unidentified anomalous phenomena or unidentified aerial phenomena, produced a report some years ago in which they tried to sift through all of the evidence to try and work out if there was any evidence for extraterrestrial phenomena here. In their report, they came up with a few quotes, such as, for instance, Carl Sagan's extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that evidence simply isn't there. They also made the point that I made early on in my talk that quite often the associated data, the metadata, are often lacking. In other words, we don't know who took it, when, what time, where were they pointing in the sky, what camera were they using, what exposure, what aperture, etc. We don't have all of that associated data, making a thorough understanding of the context difficult. And they concluded with, when you look at all the evidence that's there and you take the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, there's a few images which are difficult to explain, but that doesn't mean they're extraterrestrial. There is no conclusive evidence suggesting an extraterrestrial origin for UAPs. NASA spent a few million on that report. If they'd come to me in the first place, I could have told them that was the case, because I wrote this talk before this particular report came out. But you can still ask yourself, well, if there's no evidence for extraterrestrial UFOs, there's no evidence for the fact that we have ever been visited, let alone being visited now, we can ask ourselves, well, how likely is it that there are civilizations out there able to visit us? The number of stars in the Milky Way is about 300 billion. Most of them have got planetary systems, so we could divide that by 2 and say there are 150 billion solar systems out there. When I was young, we didn't know how many stars had planets. We now know most of them do. We also know that quite a few solar systems have planets that are Earth-like. Perhaps as many as a third of them have Earth-like planets. So that means there's something like 50 billion Earth-like planets out there. We have really got no idea how likely life is to get started, which is why we're looking for life on Mars, we're looking for life in the moons of Jupiter, for instance, or the moons of Saturn, because there's a possibility of life having started at those locations as well. And that's the big weakness of this argument, that we really do know about planets, but we don't know about life. If we assume that 99% of the time where the conditions are right for life, life does not get a hold, and it's only 1% that does, then we're left with 500 million. If we assume that life might get a hold, but only 1% of the time does it develop from simple life to complex life, then we have to divide by 100 again. And if we assume that complex life does evolve, but only 1% of the time does it evolve into what we might call intelligent life, then we have to divide by 100 again. And we're left with only 50,000 civilizations. But you could argue that if the galaxy is full of civilizations, why haven't we had contact with them yet? Why haven't we had some UFOs that are definitely indicative of people visiting us? Let alone the fact that when we look out into the universe, we find no evidence for people having been out there leaving a breadcrumb trail behind them. Maybe those numbers are all wrong. Some people say the numbers might be right, but civilizations tend to only have a finite lifetime of a few centuries rather than millions of years. That's a rather pessimistic way of thinking about civilizations, but that might be correct. The one thing we have to remind ourselves about is that we have very few data points about life. Here's the pale blue dot. There's Earth as photographed by Voyager. Look again at that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, every human being who ever was lived out their lives. On a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. The classic quote from Pale Blue Dot, Carl Sagan, 1994. It's a reminder that the only life we know about is terrestrial life, and we've got no real hard evidence either way for extraterrestrial life. But what I find more unsettling than the idea that we might have been visited by extraterrestrials is the fact that we might be alone. Thank you for listening.